Everyone. I'm Kimberly French. I'm the board president of Sustainable Middleborough. We're one of the co-sponsors of this event tonight, along with Citizens for Healthy Middleborough. And I want to just welcome everybody. It's so great to see this turnout of people who care about PFAS in our town. We know that PFAS, or I hope I can do this justice, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which are also called forever chemicals, have been a big concern for folks in our town. Certainly since 2024, when the folks in town got this letter, like I did, telling us that one of our largest public wells tested above a new state limit, or new state standard of 20 parts per trillion for 6 different PFAS chemicals. So last April, our town meeting took a very big step to mitigate PFAS in our drinking water by appropriating $33 million for a new treatment plant. And construction is slated to start on that this summer. The town also has plans to spend $100 million over the next 5 years on mitigation, and the goal is to get non-detectable levels in our public drinking water. But that is, of course, only part of the problem. As a community, we also need to turn off the tap that brings products and PFAS into our town. PFAS is in hundreds of products that we use and are exposed to all the time. But even though this problem is so huge and so global, we can't let the size of it paralyze us from taking action and starting someplace. So we are delighted to bring 2 experts on this topic to Middleborough tonight, Dr. Laurel Schreider of the Silent Spring Institute, and also Laura Spark with Clean Water Action. And they will be able to tell us, I think, whatever is known on this topic and answer your questions and help you assess your risk, what you need to know about water testing and filtration, avoiding products with PFAS, and also how we can change policy to get rid of these chemicals. So I want to mention that all 4 of our organizations have a lot of handouts, which you may have noticed. So feel free to quietly get up if you need to, maybe just a couple people at a time if you want to pick something up, or else if you need to use the restroom, which those are around the back side of this wall. So I just wanted to mention where those are. So Rich Oakley of Citizens for Healthy Middleborough, and I just want to take a couple moments first to tell you about what our organizations do locally and how you can get involved with us. So Sustainable Middleborough started back in 2017-18, and we started with an adult ed course that looked at 4 resources or services that we use here in town: energy, food, waste, and water. And our first focus has been on energy. We are a local nonprofit. Our primary campaign is to weatherize all of the pre-1980 housing in town, which will save people here energy and money on their heating bills, also another big concern in recent months. And if you have not had an energy assessment in the last 3 years, please get one of these, use this QR code, sign up. That will really help you access any rebates, tax credits, 0% loan programs. Also make a plan to use those incrementally so you can afford them a little at a time. We also have a guide to every federal, state, and local rebate or any of those incentives that are available. This is the only place you can find this for what people here in Middleborough can use. We have hired a part-time weatherization navigator, Hayden Kane. He's sitting back there in the blue shirt at the computer in case he needs to rescue us somehow with our slideshow here. And he is available to help you through the process at any point. He will set up a call or an appointment with you, pick up his card on our table. We also have a sign-up sheet if you'd like to get involved with us, or if you'd just like to be on our list to hear about events like this one or local actions you can take. We use it very sparingly for those things. So we'd love to have more people on our list. So our group is also interested in lots of issues that will help make our town livable for generations to come. Some of you may have come to our free climate resilience in your landscape workshop in January, or our do-it-yourself insulation workshop in October. And now we're so pleased to be partnering with Citizens for Healthy Middleborough about PFAS. On March 17th, our 2 groups brought to our select board a resolution which says the town will purchase certified PFAS-free products whenever they're available. And it was approved unanimously. That makes Middleborough the third municipality in the state to have passed a resolution like that, and we are very proud. We are very proud. We should all be proud of that. And so the PFAS-free procurement resolution is another great step by our town, and we felt it was really important to combine it with this event to provide education to help you understand and reduce your risk in your own home and in your own purchases. So I definitely want to work on that in my home, but we all know that even all of us in this room working on that still won't be enough to keep PFAS out of our homes and our town. The real key, I believe, is changing policy, banning these chemicals, and at this moment, the work will be at the state level. And later, Laura Spark is going to be telling us about some bills that are in the pipeline in our 2-year state legislative cycle, we at Sustainable Middleborough will also be really following these closely. We'll be sending action alerts, so a Clean Water Action, I imagine Silent Spring also, but anyway, we have lists, so I hope you'll sign up with us and learn more about that. So now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Rich Oakley, and he's been pouring his passion and his heart into learning about this and doing lots of projects and policy work.
Yep. Thank you. Let me just make sure I know how this works. Okay, so my name's Rich. I'm not necessarily part of a nonprofit. We're just a ragtag group of citizens that eventually wants to be a nonprofit someday. Citizens for a Healthy Middleborough. It's myself. It's Kristen Sadis, and it's Kelsey Canfield. And right now we just are looking into this and realizing how much we need to learn and how much there is to learn, even when you get pretty deep into it. And before I go any further, I just want to say the good news is that compared to a lot of places, Middleborough is doing pretty well, I think. And we have plans in place, and we're working on some stuff. But I think, even just looking at the jump that the federal max for PFAS came from 70 parts per trillion down to basically 4, but they split it out into 2 separate chemicals. So I think as time goes on, we're just getting much more sensitive to the health effects of these things. And I'm not going to talk about that because that's not my expertise, but luckily we have experts here to talk about that. So Kimberly was very, very kind and gave me a few minutes to plug a couple things that we're working on. So I just wanted to first point out healthymiddleborough.org is just our website. Please don't be blown away by how incredibly built out it is. It basically barely exists, but it's there, and the important part is we want you to sign up, put your email in there. So a couple things that Citizens for a Healthy Middleborough are doing are we're taking the data. So for me, I looked at that data and I said, okay, I don't know what this means. I don't really know how to put this into context. I don't know, is it near me? Is it far away from me? And so the first thing we did was we mapped it. And so we took the data that comes from the Energy and Environmental Affairs portal in Massachusetts, and we tried to do the best we could. It's a lot of stuff on one sheet, but we tried to do the best we could where we show the wells, but we also show kind of what does that mean. And here up at the top right, we explain a little bit about, oh, sorry. Yeah, that's right. We were warned too, but so anyway, we do this once a month. We try to do this once a month. So please, if you haven't yet, follow us on Facebook, Citizens for a Healthy Middleborough, and you can see our stuff. Do I do that? Oh, thank you. Hey, nice. Okay, so some other stuff that we're working on, and I'm also happy to say that we have some progress on these things as well. So our group first kind of hit the airwaves in November, I'd say. We were trying to figure out what to do. In late summer, we were working on what are our priorities, what do we want to ask for? And so we eventually put out this ask. And we're happy that some things have already happened and some things are being worked on. But if you care about these things, we would love for you guys to reach out to your select board and say that you care about these things and you stand with this pursuit and you'd like to see these things happen at a minimum in the beginning. And so these things are, we think that there are people in North Middleborough and South Middleborough that are near wells that are producing higher than other wells in terms of PFAS. And we think that there should be a source of clean drinking water that these people can go to if the water that's being piped to their house is not the best. Also, East Grove is the well that has the issues in downtown Middleborough, and although ramped incredibly down, they do still have issues, and some people still get water from these things. If you haven't already, sign up on the town's website for the alerts. You can get an alert when that well is going to run. We also think that, so we think that we should notify residents, and we want to find out where it's coming from. So I do understand that it's important to filter it, but it's still there right behind the filter the whole time. So, and it's not making it into our water anymore. I want to be clear, but if it's filtered, but whatever caused it is still there, and we want to know what that is, and can we do something to stop that? Just a quick, I think I'm already long, Kimberly. I said it would fit it under 5, but I didn't. I'm doing this next week, and I'm really excited to do this. This is an expedition that I'm going on, starting at the Assawamsett Pond, and I'm traveling all the way up the Nemasket, all the way to the Taunton, just past 44, and I'm going to get picked up somewhere in East Taunton. My wife's going to try to find me somewhere at the end of the river. And so the important part about this is that I'm going to do tests before and after each tributary enters the river. And so my hope, and this, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a person, but my hope is that by doing that, I'll be able to determine if there's been any contribution to the Nemasket or the Taunton as a result of those tributaries. And then that'll at least give me some direction, and then I can work backwards. So I just wanted to thank some people that donated tests to this effort. We really appreciate it. We found a source of tests at $70, and we got those vetted. They're not EPA certified, and I think we should definitely tell everyone to look for EPA certified tests. We're using these as a screening tool. So we kind of just want to work backwards and find out if there's any issues. And then finally, so as an individual, I've sponsored a town meeting article that wants to look at should we have an independent water commission? And the way that I proposed this was we want a study committee to ask that question, because I don't know what the right answer is on that. And I would like to think about that as a town and see what is it that these other towns, I just took Plymouth County and I just mapped it and for independent water commissions, and so Middleborough and Hanover are the only two. And I kind of just want to know why, and are we missing out? And so anyway, if you do go to town meeting, I would really appreciate it if you stick around all the way until the very end, I believe, and I would love you to vote yes on a study committee. So I think that's it. And I'd like to turn it over to our speakers. So Dr. Shader.
I just want to introduce Dr. Laurel Scheider, who's here. She's a senior scientist in environmental chemistry and engineering at the very well-respected Silent Spring Institute in Newton. She studies PFAS chemicals, exposure to PFAS chemicals in drinking water, diet, and consumer products, and she works with communities to address their concerns. She leads the Massachusetts PFAS in Your Health study, the PFAS REACH study, and she co-leads the community engagement core for the University of Rhode Island's STEEP Superfund research program. She has a master's and a PhD in environmental engineering from UCal Berkeley and a bachelor's degree in environmental engineering science from MIT. And she lives with her husband and 2 teenage kids in Watertown, which she is hoping, she told me, will adopt a PFAS-free procurement resolution like ours. I'm so glad to have her. It is such a privilege to have Dr. Scheider come to Middleborough. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Kim and Richard, for inviting me here tonight. It's really a privilege to talk to you about a topic that I think about every day. And it's great to see so many people coming out on a Wednesday night to learn more, and great to hear about all the activities that are happening here in Middleborough. So tonight I'm going to talk about PFAS, forever chemicals, and thanks for that introduction, Kim, what we know and what are the concerns. So to start with, I'm sure many of you have heard of the book, Silent Spring. We're from Silent Spring Institute. We're an independent nonprofit research organization, and our mission is to understand links between everyday chemical exposures and women's health, with a particular focus on breast cancer prevention. We were founded by visionary activists from the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition over 30 years ago. They looked at the state's first cancer registry and saw that rates of breast cancer were higher on the Cape and the islands than other parts of the state. And they said, well, what do we know about environmental causes of breast cancer? And they knew that if we could identify those, that there would be opportunities for prevention. And they realized there wasn't much research on environmental causes of cancer. Most of the research was focused on treatment and diagnosis, which are also very important, but they wanted to think upstream. And so we were founded to be a scientific research organization to ask those kinds of questions, and then to work closely with community partners like the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition in translating the science into policy, into information that people can use in their everyday lives. So for tonight, some of you likely are quite familiar with PFAS, and maybe for some of you it's the first time you're really hearing much about it. So I'm going to do a quick PFAS 101 just to introduce what these are. Kim already said the long acronym, so thank you. I don't have to say that. But where they come from and how we can be exposed to them, and what we know about how they can affect our health. I'll talk a bit about PFAS in drinking water, and then some tips that I share about what you can do. And then it's great to have Laura Spark here from Clean Water Action to really take it to the next level in terms of specific actions and legislation to get involved with here in Massachusetts. And so PFAS are in the news all the time. When I started working at Silent Spring back in 2009 and we started to first test for PFAS in drinking water in the Cape, I had actually never heard of them. There weren't really a lot of news stories about them. And now every day in the news there's some new aspect. I just heard about PFAS in milk, or there's stories about PFAS in fish. There's land contamination from addition of sludge or biosolids to farmland. And a lot of study on PFAS in drinking water. So Kim said the acronym for polyfluoroalkyl substances. So when we talk about something like mercury, mercury is just one thing, it's one metal. But PFAS is an umbrella term. So it's actually a chemical family. So there's actually at least 14,000 different chemical structures that have been identified as being called PFAS. And each one has some different characteristics. It's like a family, right? People are related, but each one has their own personality. They've been called forever chemicals because of their extreme persistence. And the reason for that is that they have many carbon-fluorine bonds. So in organic chemistry, carbon-fluorine bonds are some of the strongest bonds, high electronegativity, for those of you who've been thinking about that. And so they resist degradation. So these are all man-made chemicals, and once they get into the environment, they really don't break down. And they're also really mobile. So they've been found in every corner of the globe. They've been found in rainwater, in ocean water. They've been found even in the blood of polar bears. So these have really become global contaminants. They've also been used in consumer products since the 1950s. So you might have seen commercials, better living through chemistry, or ads for Teflon pans or Scotch-guarded rugs from decades ago. And so you might say, okay, wait, these have been in products for 70 years. Why am I just hearing about them now? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's just been really in the past, I'd say 10 to 15 years, when analytical laboratories have had the ability to measure PFAS in parts per trillion levels, which are the levels that we typically find PFAS in drinking water, or in rivers or streams. And so we have this new lens. It's likely the PFAS have been in the water for a longer amount of time, but now we're able to measure them. And so having that information has really sounded the alarm. And I think there's something, even though they're in products and they're in a lot of different facets of our life, there's something different about drinking water. And I think it really resonates with people to learn that their water, which they assume is pure and just has water in it, has these toxic chemicals. And it's also been through the work of a lot of community advocates that have really shown a spotlight on this topic. Has anyone here seen Dark Waters? So this is a Hollywood film. There's also a documentary film called The Devil We Know that came out earlier. It's about a community in West Virginia that was contaminated by a DuPont plant. And there was a farmer, Wilbur Tennant, who his cows were dying, and he knew something was wrong, and he suspected that it had something to do with the waste that was being disposed from the chemical plant. He was totally disbelieved, and they said, well, maybe you just don't know how to take care of your animals, which is totally not the case. And he enlisted a lawyer, Rob Bilott, who's played in the movie by Mark Ruffalo, who really got justice for the communities. And a lot of what we know about PFAS toxicity comes from a health study that came out of that community. So I'm not going to do a deep dive on chemistry because I realize not everyone loves chemistry and it's kind of late in the day. But if you're going to learn any PFAS chemicals, two of the ones that you need to know are PFOA and PFOS. These are what we call long carbon chain PFAS. So that zigzag in the middle with the numbers, those are carbons. And so it has this long carbon backbone, and then all those Fs around it are fluorine. So it has all these carbon-fluorine bonds, and that makes the molecule really stable. And it also has interesting chemical properties where it can repel both oil and water. So it's very useful in a lot of everyday items. So PFAS are used in a lot of things. Sometimes you can guess it has PFAS in it if it's Gore-Tex Teflon, Scotchgard, Stainmaster, Oral-B Glide Dental Floss. Laura is going to talk a lot more in great depth about the types of products in our everyday lives. But it can be really hard when you're at the store to know which products have PFAS because it doesn't usually say this product contains PFAS on it, and a lot of the products don't have a trade name. But they're in everything from cosmetics, dental floss, paints, guitar strings, rock climbing ropes, and many other uses. So they're really a part of our everyday lives. So I started working on PFAS focused on drinking water quality, but recognizing that we also get exposed through other pathways as well. I led a study in 2017 where we tested fast food packaging and found that especially paper wrappers were very likely to contain PFAS. We've found as well that people in kind of nationwide studies who report eating more fast food or more restaurant food have somewhat higher levels of PFAS in their blood. And we've also done testing of products marketed for children, especially the products that contain or have a label that says stain resistant or waterproof are likely to contain PFAS. So just a little bit of humor. So when we did our study on fast food packaging, I think one of my proud professional moments was being in The Onion, which is an online satirical newspaper. And this was their take, which included like just put the hamburger basically on my hand and skip the wrapper. But I think a more gratifying thing that came out of this was that in New York State, when they passed a ban on PFAS in food packaging, they specifically mentioned our study. For anyone who's done research is kind of slow and it's hard to see the implications, especially in a public health field where your goal is to prevent disease and to not see people getting sick as a result of your work. So it's great to see our work cited here in a really direct policy implication. So how can we be exposed to PFAS? So again, PFAS are all man-made chemicals, so they originate at an industrial production facility. They can get into the environment in several different pathways. So if you are close to a DuPont or 3M plant or close to somewhere like the St. Gobain plant in Merrimack, New Hampshire that manufactured Teflon-coated products, there can be contamination in the local community. There's a certain class of firefighting foam called AFFF, which is a Class B firefighting foam. It's used for fighting liquid fuel fires. So there's a lot of contamination near military bases, airports, and other fire training areas. And then, so those are kind of where we see the highest concentrations in the environment. And then there are a lot of places where we see lower levels, but in more places. And these can come from sources like discharges from wastewater treatment plants and septic systems, landfills, and land-applied biosolids. So kind of the waste stream, because the products we use, because businesses use PFAS, products with PFAS, that can end up in our waste stream. So PFAS can get into the environment, then we can be exposed through drinking water. Infants can be exposed during pregnancy and through breast milk. And then we can also be exposed through food as well, because the plants and animals that we eat can absorb PFAS from the food chain or from the local environment. And then we can also be exposed through the consumer products that we have in our homes. And that can be, there's potential for PFAS to be absorbed through our skin. There can be inhalation. Certain PFAS like to end up in air. They're what we call volatile. And then also dust can be a pathway of exposure. We don't really think of dust as a public health concern, but chemicals in our homes can end up in dust, and we all inhale or ingest a bit of that every day. All of this is concerning, the fact that PFAS are so widespread, because everyone's exposed. Testing conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They have a study called NHANES. They test several thousand people every 2 years, representative sampling, to get a sense of exposures to chemicals and as well to learn about nutrition and other public health questions. Their testing has found that over 99% of people who they've tested have some measurable level of PFAS in their blood, and this applies to children as well. Some PFAS are particularly long-lived in the body. So I showed you PFAS and PFOA, and other long-chain PFAS can stay in our bodies for years. So even if you stop being exposed to any new PFAS or PFOA, it takes years for the amount in your blood to go down by half, and then the same amount of time to go down by half again. So these long-chain PFAS have actually been phased out of production in the US and Europe, although there is still some production in China. So fortunately, the levels of these PFAS are going down in the general population. So they are forever chemicals, the chemical structures are persistent, but over time the levels can go down in our bodies. industry in their infinite wisdom said, okay, we won't make long chain PFAS anymore, we'll make short chain PFAS. And then they have all these other branches on the PFAS family tree. So we're now being exposed to new and different types of PFAS chemicals. Some of these have a shorter carbon chain, and these chemicals tend not to accumulate in our bodies for the same amount of time. So that's in some ways a little bit less worrisome than the ones that stay in our bodies for years, although they still can stay in our bodies for weeks to months, which is still not like rapid clearance. For instance, when you take a medication, the reason you have to take it every day is because that can be cleared from your body in hours. So these still can kind of hang around in our bodies for extended amounts of time. And there are a lot of PFAS where we don't really know how long they stay in our bodies. You might wonder, in general, who tends to have higher levels of exposure. Obviously, in communities where there's drinking water contamination, people in those communities can have elevated levels of PFAS in their blood. Workers in PFAS-related industries, and to some degree firefighters, can have higher PFAS in their blood as well from the firefighting foams. And then it's also thought that the turnout gear that firefighters wear could also be a source of exposure. In general, older adults tend to have higher levels in their blood than younger adults because these chemicals can accumulate over time, and in general, adults have higher levels than children. And you might also be interested to know that men tend to have higher levels in their blood than women, at least for premenopausal years. That's because PFAS accumulate in our blood. They bind really tightly to proteins in our blood, and so women are able to lose some of the PFAS from their bodies through menstruation. Unfortunately, we also do pass along PFAS to the next generation when we have kids, but we do see that means that, so unfortunately kids end up with PFAS in their bodies, but we do see that means that women's levels are lower. And all of this put together is really concerning because from what we've learned so far, there's overwhelming evidence that PFAS can be harmful to our health. Much of the research that's been conducted so far has focused on those long-chain PFAS, but there's growing evidence that the shorter-chain PFAS and the chemicals that are currently being used in products raise some of the same health concerns. And I won't read all of these, but I'll point out a couple of concern. In particular, one is immune system suppression. So there's been a series of studies by my colleague Philippe Grangin, who used to be at Harvard University, showing that kids who had higher exposures to PFAS seem to have less of an antibody response in response to routine vaccinations. And this is consistent with evidence from animal studies as well, showing less antibody production. And during COVID, we heard from people in a lot of impacted communities wondering if they might be at greater risk of COVID because of their high PFAS exposure. And to summarize, so Linda Birnbaum, who used to head the National Institute of Environmental Health Studies, said that PFAS basically can affect every organ system in our body. And infants and children can be particularly vulnerable, both because they can have higher exposures. So per unit body weight, kids drink more water, breathe more air, and eat more food. So they're taking in more PFAS those ways. My kids, they're teenagers now, but when they were little, they were on the floor. They always had their hands in their mouth. They were close to rugs. They were ingesting more dust. So kids can have higher exposures. And then, of course, their bodies are still developing, so they're more sensitive to the harmful effects. So switching now to talk a little bit more about drinking water specifically, it's been estimated that 200 million Americans have PFAS in their tap water. This is from the Environmental Working Group. This is a map that was produced by our colleagues at Northeastern University. They carefully kept track of sites across the country where PFAS contamination has been documented, and they also compiled information about wastewater treatment plants, landfills, and other places where there might be contamination, but there hasn't been testing for it yet. And so you can see a lot of parts of the country are pretty filled in. There are some places where there aren't a lot of dots, and some of that is because there's not a lot of people around, but some of those places are places where there really hasn't been much testing yet. So if you look at Michigan or New Hampshire or Massachusetts, there's been a lot more testing here, and so that's part of the reason why it's so filled in. So I talked a little bit already about how PFAS get into water. And so Rich talked a little bit about the drinking water standards. Until last year, there were no federal drinking water standards for any PFAS chemicals. But some states like Massachusetts were impatient and recognized the need to set standards more quickly than EPA was acting. So in 2020, Massachusetts set a standard, and drinking water standards are also known as maximum contaminant levels, that at the time was among the strictest regulations in the US. And they limited the amount of 6 PFAS chemicals, which they creatively called the PFAS 6, at 20 parts per trillion. Again, these are levels that are potentially of concern from human health perspective, but these are very low in terms of analytical chemistry. And so that's why it's only been in the past, decade or decade and a half when we've been able to measure these. A lot of other contaminants in water like lead or nitrate are at parts per billion or parts per million. And so you need really specialized instruments to be able to measure this low. And so these are mostly long chain PFAS. And so the state is limiting these at 20 parts per trillion. And it was very helpful to see the map that you put together with showing the different parts of town and which wells were over that, or the one well that was over that. And so EPA had issued unenforceable drinking water guidelines before that, so some in 2009. So when I started working on PFAS, they had levels of 200 parts per trillion for PFOS and 400 parts per trillion for PFOA. And then in 2016, they set a lifetime health advisory of 70 parts per trillion. So that was kind of bringing it down like an order of magnitude. And then last year, they set standards at 4 parts per trillion. So basically 50 to 100 times lower than what they had said back in 2009. And that's due in large part to increasing scientific evidence that these chemicals can be harmful to our health at lower concentrations than we previously thought. So here in Massachusetts, because of the standard that went in place in 2020, all public water supplies have already had to start testing for and addressing issues related to PFAS contamination. So there are over 1,400 public water supplies here in the state. And looking at the DEP website the other day, there are about 12% of water supplies that have had at least one sample that has exceeded that standard. When we say public water supply, sometimes that means the municipal water supply that serves the whole town, like the Middleborough Public Water Supply, but sometimes a public water system can serve just a school or a business or a condo building. So some of them are small and more localized. I was going to do them at the end unless it's a quick clarifying. Getting there. So I put this map together. I keep adding columns to this as I do talks in different towns to, provide some context. It's definitely concerning to have drinking water levels that are over a standard, and it's great to hear about the drinking water treatment that's being put in place. I also wanted to point out that some towns have had much higher levels in their drinking water. Just a note about this graph, or a couple of notes. One note is that this is pulling basically the single highest concentration found for each town. So it's not like the water at any tap is necessarily at this level, because usually in a water system, you're pulling water from multiple wells and it mixes together. So this is not meant to indicate like the exact exposures in each town, but just to give you a sense of the order of magnitude of contamination. So as I said, we've done a lot of work on Cape Cod, and Hyannis actually had higher levels of PFAS than any other public water supply in Massachusetts. Cape Cod is basically a sandbar. Hyannis has some of their wells basically across the street from the county fire training academy, and the groundwater flows in a certain direction and brought those PFAS from the firefighting foams, which firefighters were using for their standard practice. It was totally normal and good that they were doing their practicing. Unfortunately, that we didn't know about PFAS, and that what the result was that the foam contaminated the public wells. Hudson, I don't know as much about Hudson, but that was more of an industrial source rather than a firefighting foam source. And so you can see some patterns here. What I'm showing here are 5 of the 6 PFAS in the PFAS 6. PFDA is the 6th one, and it tends not to show up very often. And you can see that there's some different patterns, and I won't get too into the chemistry, but the yellow and the orange PFAS are the ones that tend to be associated with firefighting foam. And so you can see that those kind of dominate in Hyannis and Westfield, where we know that the main source of contamination is firefighting foam. And I don't know, I'd be curious to know more about what the possible sources here are in Middleborough, like looking kind of quickly at the data. Where you can see that's your one well that was over the state standard. It doesn't really look like it's coming from firefighting foam, because the yellow and the orange are not the biggest part of that bar. But it can be hard to use this is kind of like a simple tool to try to make a hypothesis about where the PFAS might be coming from. Especially at these lower levels, it can often be coming from a mix of different sources, so it can be hard just by looking at this kind of a graph to pinpoint it to one source. So if you want to learn more about PFAS in your drinking water, there's actually a very helpful DEP website, and they have a list of all the water supplies where PFAS was detected at least once over 10 parts per, or over 20 parts per trillion, and you can zoom in, and there's Middleborough, and it provides a little bit of information about what's happening in each town. So I found that a helpful resource. I anticipated your question, and I know there's a lot of people here in Middleborough that rely on a private well. And so the Commonwealth of Massachusetts did a private well water testing program several years ago that included 85 states, 85 towns where at least 60% of residents relied on a private well. So Middleborough was not one of those towns, although some of the towns nearby here were. And so they tested up to 50 wells in different parts of the state. And so you can see kind of where the highest levels are. I don't know. You can kind of picture where like Route 2 is and 495. There tends to be an overlap with where there's sort of more development, like along a major corridor, but not so much development that it's mostly public water supplies. But I did zoom in a little bit just to show these are the highest levels that were found in any private well. If you're curious to learn more about the work we've done on Cape Cod related to PFAS, I do have a handout about it. And I should mention we have a whole table with handouts over here, so please do take some of those. And I don't know as much about the sources to private wells here in Middleborough. On the Cape, one thing that we found is that septic systems can be a source of PFAS, and so we actually see that wells with higher levels of nitrate, and nitrate, at least in Cape groundwater, is a marker of septic system impact, on average tend to have higher levels of PFAS, and that's because the wastewater coming from our homes can be a reflection of the PFAS in the products that we use. And I get a lot of questions about PFAS and water treatment, so I'll provide some general information, and then there might be other questions that come up later. In general, there are two types of treatment that people use for PFAS treatment in their homes. So one type is activated carbon, and this can be in a couple different formats. So sometimes people have a whole house filter that has activated carbon. Some of you may have a filter pitcher with those little black pieces of charcoal. That's granular activated carbon. And then there can also be solid carbon block filters, and those tend to be like under the sink types of filters. So those tend to be very effective at removing PFAS and PFOA and other long chain PFAS, the ones that currently are the focus for most drinking water regulations. The short chain PFAS in general tend to be just more mobile. They're more mobile in the environment. They tend to have an easier time getting through filters. So when a filter is brand new, generally the short chain PFAS will be removed, but over the lifetime of a filter, they'll start to kind of sneak through the filter more quickly than the long chain PFAS. There's also reverse osmosis systems. Those tend to be right at the point of use. You don't usually have an RO system for your whole house, in part because for every gallon of treated water, you produce several gallons of wastewater. And reverse osmosis tends to be effective both for long chain and short chain PFAS. They can be more expensive, and as I said, they generate a stream of wastewater. And giving a talk, I think it was in Harvard, Mass., someone told me that there's some regulations about having an RO system if you have a septic system in your home. I don't know if that's true here. And then we have some general tips about information or kind of certifications that you can look for water filters. You kind of don't want to just take a water filter manufacturer's word for it that their filter is effective for removing PFAS. So there are some certifications that you can look for, and we do have a handout that mentions these. I will note that as far as I know, these still are only certifying that a filter can meet the old EPA guideline of 70 parts per trillion, so they aren't geared towards making sure we're meeting the standard here in Massachusetts, and the EPA standards are pretty new, so these likely will, if you have a filter that will meet this standard, my guess is it's probably going to meet those stricter standards, but that's not what they're actually testing for yet. My guess is they will be updating those. So just to wrap up, I know sometimes like hearing all of this can be kind of overwhelming to know that these toxic persistent chemicals are everywhere in our lives and in our bodies, and they're harmful to our health. But I always like to leave with some things that we can do, because all of us can take actions to protect our health and our communities. And Laura's going to talk even more about these. But specifically for kinds of things we can do in our everyday lives to avoid PFAS, unless you really need it, like selecting textiles and other products that don't have stain-resistant qualities, avoiding microwave popcorn because microwave popcorn bags, at least in the past, were coated with PFAS. The FDA changed their approvals, and so my understanding is that, at least in theory, paper-based packaging is no longer supposed to have PFAS, no longer allowed to have PFAS. But I'm not sure how much testing or enforcement there is, especially for imported. And I hope someone will do some testing and kind of look at the current marketplace to see if things have changed since we did our study several years ago. Eating more fresh foods is always a good idea. Again, trying to avoid that food packaging. If there are PFAS in your water that you're concerned about, looking into testing and then treatment for PFAS. And then in terms of like where to start, sometimes it's a little overwhelming. I'd say like start with a change that you can make. You're not going to tackle all of these at once. There's lots of chemicals in our everyday lives, not just PFAS as well. So sometimes you just have to pick like something to start with and kind of build on that and not try to tackle it all at once. And I'd say when you're shopping too, you can say like, do I really need this to be stain resistant? Sometimes it's like a nice feature, but sometimes you can pick a simpler solution or be okay with getting stains on your couch so that you don't bring a couch in that's going to have these chemicals that, for a long time. We have a tip card on our table over there about our smartphone app called Detox Me, which offers all kinds of tips and information based on our research and other research studies with guidance about ways that you can select products or take steps in your everyday lives to reduce your exposures to toxic chemicals. Specifically related to PFAS, as part of one of my research studies called PFAS Reach, we developed an online resource center called the PFAS Exchange, which is intended to support impacted communities and really anyone wanting to learn more about PFAS. We've got a tool to help people interpret results of water and blood tests, resources for clinicians. We have that map that we worked on with our partners at Northeastern University, and we even have a quiz, which is a way to kind of engage and test your knowledge about PFAS. And these are some of the fact sheets that we have on the table there, which I hope you will stop by and take some of to bring home. And then for one of the other studies that I'm a part of, the URI STEEP Superfund Research Program, we also have additional, kind of a different format, so whichever type is more appealing to you with information for well owners and ways you can reduce your exposure. We also are having a webinar on April 17th at noon. And we've got the QR code for it over there, talking specifically about PFAS in fish. And then some ways to get involved, and I probably won't read all these because Laura's going to go into this in great depth. I always talk now about procurement policies in towns and workplaces, but it's great to hear you're already working on that here in Middleborough. Yeah, I'd say there's things that all of us can do. There's some things we can do as individuals, but then it's really collective action is what we need to turn off the tap. So with that, thank you so much. This is a rare moment of sibling harmony, but these are my kids and the real reason I do this work. So thank you. Do you want to do questions at the end?
We are going to have time for questions, but I want to have Laura have a chance to speak too, because I know she might cover some things you're thinking about. So Laura Spark is the Environmental Health Program Director at Clean Water Action, and she's worked for more than 25 years as an urban planner, focusing on housing, poverty, and sustainability. And I found this very interesting. She began volunteering with Clean Water Action in 2002 when the Massachusetts office needed a pregnant mom to go to the State House to talk about mercury in fish. And then some years later, in 2018, she joined the staff to coordinate advocacy on toxic chemicals and carbon pricing. She has a master's in both architecture and city planning from MIT, and she lives in Jamaica Plain. And I just want to say, again, in my opinion, all of these things are so important. Mitigation, research, education, protecting ourselves, all super important. But changing the policies that allow PFAS into our homes and communities is, I think, the real key. And we're so very fortunate to have Laura come to Middleborough and tell us about her work and what we can do to help her with the work. Thank you.
So, how do I?
There's a forward button.
Okay, here I am. So thank you very much. Thanks, Kim and Richard, for inviting us. So as Kimberly said, my name is Laura Spark. I'm the Environmental Health Program Director at Clean Water Action. Clean Water is a multi-issue environmental nonprofit. A lot of times people think, oh, you're a water organization. We're actually named because we were one of the main nonprofits behind the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. We're actually a multi-issue environmental nonprofit. We work on clean water, clean energy, clean air, and the removal of toxic chemicals from consumer products in the environment. I am going to, usually I have a longer presentation that I do, but it goes over a lot of the material that Dr. Shader just went over, so I'm going to do a very abbreviated version. So just a reminder, sometimes you see over 14,000 chemicals, sometimes over 15,000. It moves around. About more like 6,000 are actually used in commerce, but basically there are a lot of chemicals. And they make things stain resistant, non-stick, and waterproof. They are also thermally and chemically stable, so that makes them very useful in a lot of different applications. Again, I think we already went over this, but DuPont and 3M are the two big companies behind the introduction of the initial PFAS chemicals into commerce. DuPont created PFOA, used to make Teflon. We both have the same happy pan image. PFOS, a couple of years later, was introduced by 3M, and that is Scotchgard. So 3M made the PFOS was what gets applied to textiles. PFOA is what was put on Teflon, and both of the chemicals, those are individual chemicals in the large PFAS class. Again, repeating what Dr. Shader said, but sometimes people are initially confused about that. So while those first two chemicals were introduced around the 1940s, 1950s, the uses of PFAS expanded rapidly, particularly in the 70s. And they have been applied to lots of different types of consumer products. And specifically, the ones on the slide are the ones we're going to talk about, tips for avoiding PFAS in these products. So carpets, carpet cleaning products, food packaging, furniture textiles, as well as clothing textiles, outdoor gear, umbrellas, sleeping bags, tents, anything that you might have in the outdoors and want waterproofed. Cosmetics, protective coatings, non-stick cookware, car seats, and as we talked about, firefighting foam and adhesives and sealants. Also firefighting foam. Again, as Dr. Shader said, that is one of the most important and problematic uses. And firefighting foam, again, it's not used that often because it's used to fight large fuel-driven fires. We don't have a lot of those, but if an airplane crashes, if a chemical plant blows up, then you need that foam. It's kind of like shaving cream, sort of almost. And unfortunately, though, so 3M worked with the military to create the foam, and then the military actually required everyone across the country, the military and aviation, to use PFAS-containing foam. And firefighters were required to train with it at least quarterly. So that is the reason why we see so much contamination. So again, sometimes there's an actual fire, an actual airplane crash and an actual fire site, but really a lot of the heavy contamination we've seen are near training sites. Again, airports, military facilities. Just want to briefly touch on other sources. So in general, we're going to talk about a couple of ways you can avoid products with PFAS. But PFAS are used in hundreds of different things. And you can't actually fully avoid them. So one of the main uses is PFAS are used in many different manufacturing processes. Paper, rubber, metal, manufacturing. They're really key in electronics, including semiconductors. So we're all probably carrying around, our phones. They all have some PFAS in them. aerospace, aerospace, automotive industries, photographic supplies, chrome plating, and even actually soil and water remediation. Another very typical use is in building products. PFAS are in almost any aspect of building that you can think of. They are in roofing, lots of different types of roofing, where they're used just to help the roof shed water and dirt. They are used in coatings, paint, sealers, lacquers, caulk, adhesives, tapes, including plumber's tape, insulation around electric wiring, cables, artificial turf, seismic damping systems, and then very challenging for people like us who care about clean energy, they're in a lot of different clean energy applications. They are used as a coating on PV panels, again, to help the PV panels shed water and soil. They are in refrigerants, in heat pumps, and I'll come back to that in a minute. They're in lithium ion and other batteries, wood milk coatings, and then cleaners and waxes, especially floor waxes and pesticides. So that is challenging because a lot of us, I love those clean energy applications. I have an electric car, probably a bunch of you have heat pumps. The good news with a number of these things is that there are safer alternatives. But it's difficult to find them just if you're sort of out in the marketplace. And I will come back to refrigerants in a minute. They're also, and this is another complicated aspect of PFAS, they are in a lot of medical devices, pharmaceuticals, veterinary products. And so obviously a lot of these are products we want, and there are actually alternatives to PFAS in a lot of these products. One of the challenges that we have as advocates is that the chemical industry has said, oh, well, you need medical products, you need pharmaceuticals, don't go after PFAS. Or make sure to create a permanent exemption. So sure, you can get it out of food packaging, but don't touch medical devices and don't touch HVAC, don't touch refrigerants. The problem is that refrigerants are something called F gases, and they are actually 59% of the PFAS uses in Europe. We haven't done a similar calculation in the United States, but we assume it's relatively similar. In Europe, they are using alternatives to PFAS, F gases. In the United States, we use alternatives to PFAS in some larger heating applications, larger refrigeration applications, but we don't yet have an alternative to residential scale heat pumps. But we could get there within 5 to 10 years. So again, I just want to reinforce what Dr. Shader said. PFAS are in water and soil and plants and animals because they're in products. And this whole cycle, this is one that was done by the European Environment Agency, similar to the one that Dr. Shader has, that I think was done by Harvard School of Public Health. And it's basically making the same point that PFAS are in the environment, are in water because they get out of consumer goods and humans are exposed. Industry, when consumer goods are made, industry releases PFAS to the air and water. Also, we have the issue with firefighting foam, both from industrial streams as well as from our own homes. PFAS gets into the waste stream. When in the process of processing wastewater, PFAS are actually concentrated. And the problem with that is that the sludge that's left over as wastewater and waste are processed, there's 3 places it can go. It can be incinerated, it can be put in a landfill, or it can be put on agricultural land. In Massachusetts, we put 40% of our sludge is land applied, 15% in our state and 25% in other states. Incineration also isn't good because it just means that PFAS or other toxic chemicals go into the air. Landfilling is probably the best option we have right now, but even in landfills, PFAS is in the air above landfills and it gets out into the leachate. So PFAS are a big, messy problem. So just to come back to tips and what you can personally do, similar tips to Dr. Shader. You definitely do not want to be buying and eating microwave popcorn. If you do use, we all do takeout sometimes. These are some of the things that we advise people to do. PFAS go from food packaging into food, particularly hot and greasy food. So you want to take, if you've got something in a container, just take it out, and put it on a plate. Don't use your wrapper as a placemat, and don't store food in takeout containers. I have stored food in Chinese food containers for years, but you want to just take it out, put it in a glass container. PFAS can be in paper or plastic food packaging. It can be in compostable fiber products, including those molded fiber products that look like, I think they kind of like it's like a slurry of wood and water that gets dried on a mold, so like a sweet greens bowl or a kava bowl. Up until 2 years ago, they all had PFAS in them, and then some new products came to the market, and one of the World Centric is one product that you may see. If you're going to buy disposable foodware or those compostable bowls, you want to make sure that it's Biodegradable Products Institute or BPI certified. Those do not have PFAS. But also know that there are products with eco-friendly names that still may have PFAS. There's actually less PFAS in food packaging now, really in large part to Silent Spring's work. 13 states have banned PFAS in food packaging, including all of the New England states except us. And 12 of those states' bans are already in effect. New Hampshire is actually going to be in effect. There was also an effort to go kind of hold feet to the fire of some of the large, like McDonald's, Burger King, Chipotle, Cava. There's a group called Toxic Free Future that asked all of them to make commitments to be PFAS free, and many of them did make those commitments. And then after they made the commitments, many of which were already in effect, then Consumer Reports came back and tested and found that some of them still did have PFAS in a number of their products. Cava is one in particular, and that's one I'd be careful about because they had very high levels. But if you want to kind of look into, like if you do eat at those, those fast food chains or those, what they call it, fresh casual or, actually, it's one of the things that was surprising is that that food packaging in the casual, kind of healthy casual, often had higher levels and more PFAS in the studies. Again, things have been changing though because a number of the businesses really made an effort to try to get out of PFAS in food packaging. If you go to a website, Mind the Store, you can see who has gotten out of PFAS and who has not. But another thing where you can take action is on carpets and textiles. Carpets and rugs, furniture, textiles and leathers, clothing, bedding, outdoor gear, shoes and boots, anything that says that it's stain resistant or waterproof is likely to have PFAS. There are some alternatives, and PFAScentral.org is one of the best places to go to. There's a shopper's guide over on the table, and it has links to all of these places where you can look up alternatives. Personal care products are another place where you can take action to reduce exposure. You want to avoid cosmetics with PTFE, that's Teflon, and that any ingredient that starts with perfluoro. But most cosmetics with PFAS are not labeled. You do want to avoid long-lasting or waterproof. If it says that, there's a good chance that the product may have PFAS. If you want, but one way to know for sure is to look it up. And I'm sure that a number of you have already looked at the EWG. Have any of you looked at the EWG website or know what that is? Oh, so not most people. So Environmental Working Group is a national nonprofit that does a lot of investigations. It has a number of different databases on safer products. One of which is Skin Deep, which is a database where you can just go in and type in whatever shampoo or toothpaste or whatever it is you use, and it will pop up with. They've done investigations and they kind of label things from 1 to 10. I think 10 as being the most toxic and 1 being the least toxic, and you can look up what's relatively less toxic. Again, PFAScentral.org is a little bit easier. Oh, can you hear me? Sorry. PFAScentral.org is a little bit easier to use. It's just a list of PFAS-free products in a couple of different categories. And then period products also may have PFAS. Period underwear, much of that does have PFAS, not all of it. And some tampons and sanitary napkins. Mamavation that's a website of a blogger. I usually don't recommend. He's a kind of a influencer kind of blogger type of person, but she does do, she partners with credible scientists, and she has a list of PFAS-free period products, and also some other kinds of products. Another thing just to be aware of is eyeglass sprays often have very high levels of PFAS, and contacts. So last, cookware, so what got us started down this road. One thing, because people have become aware that cookware has PFAS in it, there's been an effort by some cookware manufacturers to be a little bit misleading. So a number of cookware manufacturers have advertised that their nonstick cookware is PFOA or PFOS free without saying it has other PFAS. So in general, you want to avoid nonstick cookware. There are a few, if you absolutely must have nonstick cookware, you want to look for silicone enamel options. And the challenge, as you can see, is one of the things is that you kind of have to do a lot of research, right? You have to go and look at different databases to try to figure out, well, how am I going to have PFAS-free dental floss? And the shopper's guide that is on the table links to a bunch of different databases. There's, I think, in addition to the ones we've just mentioned, there's also a good one for cleaning products, which also often have PFAS in them. And there's also on the table a list of certifications that are third-party certifications that certify that products are PFAS-free. But mostly what I do is I am trying to pass a bill to ban PFAS in most products. And there is a bill that was introduced last session. It did not pass, and we're hoping to pass it this session. It is based on the recommendations of a task force that met 4 years ago that considered the PFAS problems in Massachusetts and issued a set of recommendations. And among those recommendations were the items that are part of this bill. So the bill was introduced by Senator Sear, who represents Cape Cod, including the towns that have very high levels of PFAS, and Representative Hogan, who represents Hudson, which had an industry, a wire coating industry that caused fairly high levels of PFAS in that town. So what this bill does, that's been introduced and we're hoping to pass, is that first it sets up a fund to test and treat both public water systems and private wells for PFAS. And the hope is that that fund gets populated with the money that we will eventually receive from the Attorney General's lawsuit against PFAS manufacturers. It requires manufacturers to disclose and pay a fee if they add PFAS to their products. That's important because, as we just said, as we were looking through the products, in most cases you don't know if a product has PFAS or not because manufacturers aren't required to tell you. It also restricts industrial releases to groundwater and surface water. Then the piece that my agency's been doing a lot of work on is it restricts PFAS in products. First, it restricts PFAS in the products that we've just been talking about. All of these products on the top, we consider sort of low-hanging fruit because other states have already banned PFAS in all of those products, and there are ready alternatives to PFAS in all of those products. So ideally, you wouldn't have to be looking at a database to figure out what carpet to buy. But the other thing is because as you can tell, that it's also in manufacturing and building products and medical products. We do need to go beyond that listed products in order to actually prevent PFAS from continuing to get into the environment. So the bill authorizes the Department of Public Health to restrict PFAS in additional products based on a study that the Toxic Use Reduction Institute, which is a research group at University of Massachusetts Lowell, would do. And basically what they would do is they would identify where PFAS is being used and identifying which industries have alternatives available or could soon have alternatives to PFAS. The bill also requires a study of PFAS in agriculture and restricts some land application of PFAS on farms. There is a second bill that we're also supporting that goes a little bit further and bans all land application of PFAS-containing sludge. It also requires the state to develop a sludge management plan, which probably not the most fun thing to do, but something that needs to be done, and provides funding and support to farmers who lose their land or homes due to PFAS contamination, which is something that has happened in other states like Maine, Texas, New Mexico, and Michigan. So what we are asking, one of the things that we try to get people to do in all of the communities that we go and talk to is to have people talk to their legislators. You have a kind of an interesting mix of legislators in Middleborough because you have both Republicans and Democrats, and you have two new legislators. And they may not be as familiar as existing legislators with this legislation. So one of the things we're asking is for people to ask your legislators to co-sponsor the bills. Lenatra did in past sessions, but nobody signed on as co-sponsoring the bill. And you can do that just by sending an email. We have also in the handouts, we have a list of each of your representatives and senators and contact information. You could also write a message in the postcard that is also on the table. And if you want to write the message just once and do it while you're here, I can copy it and hand it in, or you can take it with you and mail it in yourself. Another thing that's really powerful is just meeting with your legislators. Most of them have coffee hours. Also, you're an organized group, so you could invite them to come here and just talk about your concern about PFAS and ask where they stand on this legislation and whether they would support it. And then as the process goes along, our legislative process is a year and a half. We just started it. It's January. It's going to end a month from July. There's usually key points at which it is helpful to email or call your legislators again and say, are you prioritizing this bill? Are you speaking to leadership about this bill? What are you hearing about this bill? And what we usually do is we contact our members and send an action alert and ask them to take action. What we are thinking of doing with your groups is just contacting Kimberly and Richard, who can send out an action alert. That way you do not get our fundraising emails, which is convenient, but you get a notice of key times when it would be helpful to just send an email in. And in general, we'll write up these emails. You could just hit a button. But if you write your own personal email, even if it's just one sentence, it's much, much more effective. And legislators take it much more seriously. They care about what you think, not so much advocacy organizations. And then the one other thing I just wanted to point out, because I think it's really a fabulous movie, and Dr. Shader is in it, is there is a 45-minute documentary called The Poison in Us All. There have been several movies made about PFAS. I think this is one of the best. And what's interesting about it is that it covers the story of Mara Strande, who's was a young woman in Minnesota who died a couple of days before a PFAS bill was passed that has been named after her. She was highly exposed to PFAS in water in her high school. She and her family ended up fighting very hard to pass a bill to restrict PFAS. Minnesota now has the strongest PFAS bill in the nation. And so it covers her story, but it also covers the story of people in Massachusetts who are affected by PFAS, but not at the level that she was, or at the level that, for example, firefighters are, many of whom, so we did pass a bill this past session to restrict PFAS in firefighter personal protective gear, and that is because a lot of firefighters have been getting cancers at elevated rates, and PFAS is part of the story there. So it sort of shows we're all affected by PFAS, but we're not all affected in the same way or as seriously. And part of what we're trying to do is eliminate PFAS because it's toxic at such a low level, and it's persistent. Once it's out there in the environment, it stays in the environment. So we don't want to get to the point where we are more heavily impacted and have more of these tragic stories. So that is it.
So we're happy to take some questions for our guests, and Rich or I will bring around a microphone so you can speak to the microphone.
Is the recording, are the presentations recorded?
Yes.
And where's the recording?
So it's on our local access television station, MCCAM, and once they put that up, which usually happens right away, we'll put it on our website, sustainablemiddleborough.org.
Good evening. I would just like to thank the two of you for coming out, as well as Kimberly and Rich for putting this on. I think this is a very informative and important topic that we all need to discuss and have takeaways from so that we can mitigate our impact with PFAS in our community and beyond. With PFAS, it seems to me this is kind of like the new asbestos issue. Asbestos was widely used in shipbuilding. We've seen the commercials for lawyers that, lawsuits and what have you. And by and large, asbestos was safe so long as it didn't start breaking down. When it got airborne, that's when it was so detrimental. It seems that PFAS is similar by way of like Teflon coating, is it's relatively safe until it starts breaking down. So with that, how do we best dispose of any Teflon material, up to and including, like, I recently just got a PFAS water filter pitcher in my home. I'm looking to do a whole home water filtration system. How are the filters properly disposed of so we don't keep this vicious cycle going on and on and on?
Great, thanks for your kind words and for your question. I'd say short answer is we don't really have a good solution. That's the problem with having these very persistent chemicals. In terms of, we get this question, how much of an exposure pathway are Teflon pans? Because Teflon itself is this long carbon chain with lots of fluorines around it, and that big molecule by itself is not what you're going to find in your drinking water. It's probably not going to end up that much in your body. We do worry about all the building blocks, like Teflon comes from somewhere. It comes from stitching together smaller PFAS molecules. And so I don't know that there's been a lot of studies to show this, but I would guess that a brand new pan is likely to still have some residual of those kind of smaller PFAS left over from the manufacturing process, either as building blocks or processing aids or other parts of that chemistry. Like there's a lot of impurities in the process and chemicals that come together to create that Teflon pan. And then in sort of the middle of the life of the Teflon pan, if you don't overheat it, probably there's not that much PFAS coming off. Any of those smaller molecules that were there maybe already ended up in your food or got washed off. And then towards the end of the life, when it starts flaking off, like you definitely want to not use it when it's flaking like that. I will, like, even the manufacturers say that if you overheat the pan, that the fumes can be toxic, particularly to birds, and I have to imagine not that good for people either. I don't have a good solution to disposal for all the reasons Laura mentioned. We can put in a landfill. And newer landfills, I guess, are better than older landfills, but the leachate from landfills now will go to wastewater treatment plant. From unlined landfills, the leachate goes into the ground. Incineration, at very high temperatures, PFAS do break down, but municipal waste doesn't typically go to that kind of an incinerator. There's all kinds of environmental justice concerns. We don't really know about the chemistry, but those PFAS molecules probably don't completely break down, and so there's concerns about airborne exposures and contamination of local areas. So I don't know. It's a question that we struggle with. I think about it with flame retardants also. If you have a couch with flame retardants and you want to get it out of your house because you don't want a couch with flame retardants, what's the ethical thing to do with that if you don't want it because it is toxic chemicals? You know, is it okay to give it to a secondhand store? I don't know. That doesn't feel good, but throwing it out doesn't feel good. There's no good solution. And so, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. There's no good answer.
It's really challenging. There's no good disposal option.
Some people have suggested to send it back to DuPont or 3M.
There are filters that you send them back. Like cycle pure one, where you use your filter, it gets a PFAS, and instead of just throwing it in the trash and saying someone else's problem, at least I didn't drink it. Yeah, you can mail it back to them. They give you free sugar.
Yeah.
What they do with it, who knows? They could just I don't know.
Yeah.
But there are, some.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of PFAS that you're going to pick up in a filter, that's probably not like a high quantity of it. It is a really big issue, though, especially with the new standards and water treatment plants putting in basically, it's often like a 20-ton Brita filter. And so that's a really big question. It's important to filter the water to get the PFAS out so people aren't exposed. But what to do with that? You can regenerate activated carbon at high temperatures, and in theory, that should break apart the PFAS, but if there's not high enough temperatures or good monitoring, there's concerns about that. And then there's other types of filters at the municipal level that none of them are really breaking down the PFAS. It's just getting out of the water. And so you just have that issue at a bigger scale.
Other questions?
Okay.
Are you familiar with a chlorination system on well water? Does that work against PFAS? Chlorination, dechlorination?
No,
No.
that won't break down
Doesn't
the
work
PFAS.
or?
It won't work for
Won't work
PFAS.
for PFAS. Okay, thank you. Just what I need to know.
Okay. I came across PFAS and PFAS as a result of adopting my son, who spent 6 months in utero at a Air Force base and was exposed as an embryo to 2,500 parts per trillion of PFAS. And over the years, as he's grown, he's had significant learning disabilities, and today he's developed autism as a result of this exposure. And just last month, there's finally been research showing that PFAS affects, I'm a biologist, so excuse the terminology, but mitochondria and nucleus and DNA are all adversely affected by PFAS. And I want to point out that those of you who have been in the military have been on military bases where you have consumed water that initially was contaminated as a result of these monthly drills that they have people on these bases use on the runways, because they have to practice these drills in case of plane crashes. So if any of you have been in the military or still are in the military, or you have children who want to go into the military, when they go to these bases, they shouldn't be drinking the tap water, because the aquifers under these military bases are contaminated with this stuff that has been used since the 1940s. I think at this point, I hopefully have made you aware of how dangerous this stuff is and what far-reaching effects it can have. One more thing. If you have been contaminated, there's a process called epigenesis. In epigenesis, your DNA is changed as a result of being exposed to pollutants, and you might not come down with the disorder, but your children will get the disorder caused by this chemical and develop things like spina bifida, for instance, is one that's very common. It's a whole series of others. I would also point out that if you're interested in looking at this situation in more depth, tonight's presentation was excellent, but you can get more of an insight in this to take a look at a site on the internet called civilianexposure.org, civilianexposure.org, and on that you will see that a lot of the military people, even though they're covered by the veterans, under veterans care that they get from the federal government, their wives and children who were on these bases are not covered. And so this is another huge problem that you should be aware of.
Thank you. Is there another question?
Okay.
Did I see a question over here? Okay. Here. Well,
Yeah, sure. We'll do one over here and we'll come back here.
okay.
I have two questions that might be cheating, but one's short-term, one's long-term. So the short-term one is, we've got a well and we were looking at ways to test for the 6 PFAS. Some of the tests cost at the more established laboratories. They were quoting $600 to $750 for that test. Online, you can find a whole range of things, all the way down to $79 for cyclopluer. Is there any reason to trust the cheaper online mail-in tests any less than the established labs?
Yeah, great question about water testing. So there are, so the difference I would say between so the Mass DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, has some labs that they've certified for following EPA methods to quantify PFAS in drinking water. I'd say the tests are more like $300, not $600 anymore, which is still like a lot more expensive than $71 for the cyclopure test. But I think the prices have come down somewhat. And I know the Barnstable County lab is starting to offer PFAS testing. In order to be certified by the state, the laboratory has to go through extensive testing, and there's someone looking over their shoulder and saying, like, okay, are the results really reproducible and accurate? For the cyclopure test, I don't have any. I know that there are groups like the Riverkeeper group, which has done testing of surface waters and used the cyclopure test. In theory, it should work. What's nice about the cyclopure test, instead of having to get a cooler and ice to send the bottles back to the lab, is they send you, it's like a small plastic cup with a a material at the bottom, like a filter that traps the PFAS really well. It's something that's also used for remediating groundwater because it binds onto PFAS really well. So you put a known volume of water through that, the water drips through, the PFAS get stuck to that, and then you can send back that filter in a cardboard box and you don't need the ice and all that. So in theory, it should do similarly in terms of performance, but it doesn't have that same certification in terms of testing to make sure that the results are accurate. And if I'm happy to, I don't have a slide with it, but to talk more about the specific labs that are certified here in Massachusetts.
The quotes that I got at 6 and 750, that's recently. That was like 3 months ago.
Okay. I have gotten a couple of water tests, just like not for work, but personally, and those were more like $300. I do think there, depending on which lab it is, some labs will test for like 50 different PFAS, and some will test for like 10. And so the longer that list is, the higher the price will be. So,
Makes sense.
and it's all in acronyms too. But the more it is, and also some tests are more sensitive than others. So if you look at the limit of detection or reporting limit, that's the lowest level that the lab can report back to you. So some labs are more sensitive. Again, that tends to mean a more expensive test. So sometimes it's cost, but it's also like what's the level of information that you're getting.
Okay. Can I ask my long term, or do you want to rotate? I don't know. I'll let the answer. I'll ask it, and then they can punt. So it took us humans a heck of a long time to figure out the toxicity and the threat and the deadliness of this stuff. Right? 70 years is absolutely mind-boggling. So it makes me wonder all kinds of things. But it also suggests that at a policy level, seems like federal legislation is going to be absolutely necessary to really tackle this thing long term, because they're now inventing replacements. I'm just thinking about in our lifetime all of the solutions that turned into the next generation's big problem.
Can I answer that? Yeah. Okay. So, unfortunately, and for more reasons we have time to go into now, toxic chemicals are like guns. They're not going to be regulated at the federal level. The chemical industry is, even before the current administration, the chemical industry is simply too influential in just the dynamics. It is not possible to move toxic policy at the federal level now. And and right now, the person who's in charge of toxic chemical policy at the EPA is actually a former lobbyist for the American Chemistry Council, who's really, for us, for someone like me, is sort of my Voldemort, my nemesis. They're not, users of the chemical. We're just trying to make a buck. They are the people who are really spreading misinformation about chemicals and are really committed to staying in this sort of toxic chemistry. And she's in charge of, so right now it's sort of like the upside down world in terms of toxic. But even before the Trump administration, it has just not been possible to move policy that restricts the use of toxic chemicals at the federal level. So what has happened is that states are moving at the state level, and what happens is if enough states move, then it is simply not worth it for manufacturers to make one product to meet, California's requirements. And California is, a huge economy, once California and a couple of other states move, then the market moves. And that is what has happened that's what happened on flame retardants. That is what we're hoping will happen on PFAS. The other thing with PFAS is, as those of you who watch Dark Waters or The Devil We Know, there was a lot of obfuscation, and in the case of 3M and DuPont, they lied for years and said that they knew 2 years after PFAS and PFOA were introduced that they were toxic, and they did not reveal that to the public. And when people brought up concerns or suspicions, they they downplayed them and misrepresented the science. So obviously not every industry is going to do that. They really were bad actors over a very long period of time. So that's part of what I think makes this story so enraging, and part of why it took so long. If they had been clearer about the science, they have internal scientists who do science, and there's actually a woman who did a webinar recently with the Mass Breast Cancer Coalition talking about being I'm forgetting whether she was with 3M or DuPont. 3M, talking about she discovered that there was toxicity issues. She brought it to her supervisors, poo-pooed, and they didn't let on. The other scientists had brought the exact same concerns to them. So they really acted unethically over a period of decades. So that's part of why it was so long in coming. Yeah.
This is an economics problem. If we are still purchasing things that have that poison in them, then they'll keep making them.
Right.
So we, as consumers, need to be the ones to
Right.
make the change.
And that is, so there's this group, Toxic Free Future, and they have done a series of Mind the Store campaigns to try to get PFAS out of products. One that we were involved with is REI. REI had PFAS in a lot of its textiles because, outdoor, waterproof, and now they don't in most of their products. So those market-based campaigns are very, very effective. Targeting specific businesses or a range of businesses.
Just had two things. The gentleman that just asked about the Cyclopure home water test, I have a little anecdotal evidence to support the veracity of the test. I had purchased one of those tests at the beginning of March, tested my water from my tap, sent it away, and I was talking to our town manager, James McGrail, and he's like, hey, would you mind sharing those results with me? I'd love to pass it on to a water and superintendent, Jim Bumpus, and did so, and he said, wow, that's identical, because they had just tested the Mazaris well, which I live in North Middleborough. The numbers were identical from the Cyclopure at-home test compared to the $700 test that the town had used. So if that's any help in your decision-making process, I hope that's good. But one thing to this gentleman over here, talking about the water contamination on military installations, I have a brother who passed away on July 27th of 2016. He was stationed down at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune. I'm also a Marine myself. And back in July of 2008, he had emergency surgery. His organs were essentially rotting out inside. He was on the verge of becoming septic. His intestines had perforated so much that he had to have emergency surgery. Fast forward to December 7th of 2008, he had a 6-organ transplant where he received a small intestine, large intestine, stomach, pancreas, liver, and esophagus. And anybody that knows about organ transplants, certainly a multi-organ transplant, somebody has to die in order to donate those organs. Like I said, he lived for just shy of 8 years, and he died at 52 years old due to renal failure, and the direct result was water contamination on Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. We all know, we see the ads now for lawyers looking for lawsuits for those affected, but yeah, my brother never got disability for it because it wasn't a covered illness or injury as deemed by the VA. And to your point as well, civilians, they have virtually no recourse. They can't go to the VA if they have any sort of health issues at all. So this is like major stuff. Like, water is an essential part of life. We need water to survive. And this is of utmost importance that we take this seriously and that we push the needle towards getting safe drinking water for everybody, and it affects all ages, races, demographics, socioeconomic, all these different elements. It affects each and every one of us. So
I want to take some more questions. I know for our experts, I have a. Okay. I don't. White sweater. Oh, you. Okay.
Oh, hi. I had it was a comment and a question. I had read this summer a newspaper article about the high concentrations of PFAS in sea foam at the beach. It's much higher than in the actual water, which is like, you just picture like the kids just picking up the sea foam. So that's just a comment. But I kind of had a comment question about the sludge. I don't know if you could like maybe talk about like our agricultural sludge, what that actually means. I mean, I did some reading about it, and I know we would send our sludge up to some company in Maine, and they were processing it, making agricultural like fertilizer and whatnot for the farmers. But I also read that the state of Maine has prohibited applying that sludge to the crops or to the fields now. But it just brought up the point to me that sometimes we just ship our things to another state, right? It's like it needs to be accountability all around. That's it. I don't know if you could speak to the sludge and what that actually is.
Maine and Connecticut are the two states that have banned the land Maine and Connecticut are the two states that have banned the land application of sludge. And Maine actually was unusual in that they had a map so that they knew where sludge was land applied. We've mostly land applied it since the 70s. The thought was that it was beneficial reuse because there are nutrients along with toxins in the waste stream. So they've banned it, as well as Connecticut. Our state has not banned it and is looking. The Department of Environmental Protection is looking at setting a what they would call a protective level for the amount of PFAS in sludge. We're concerned that it's hard to set that level because they have not yet tested in Massachusetts to have a sense of what the existing levels of PFAS are in farm soil and water. So that's a process that's going forward administratively with the Department of Environmental Protection. There's also this bill. The bill to actually ban land application of sludge has a harder road than that other multi-issue bill, in part because the Department of Environmental Protection is not sold on banning it because they don't know what else to do with it, actually.
And just if I could just pick up on your other question about the sea foam. So definitely in water bodies where there's high PFAS in the water, you can have higher PFAS on the surface because of their chemical structures. The PFAS like to be at the air-water interface because part of their molecule actually doesn't like to be in water. And so there are some ponds and lakes where there's high PFAS in the water where the foam is likely to have PFAS. I would say not every sea foam, and especially like ocean water, because there's unless it's sort of an enclosed area with dilution, is probably not going to be PFAS type of foam, but it definitely has been an issue in some areas, especially freshwater bodies where there's a lot of PFAS in the water. And I wanted to thank the two of you for sharing about your family's stories and elevating the issues with military members and military families. I know at Camp Lejeune, I think it's less so PFAS and more TCE, which is a solvent that was the main water contaminant. But I think it's really important to know that PFAS and TCE, and there's a range of chemicals that can be that have been in the water at military bases. For people who are likely to have had high exposures from past jobs or being at a military base, there are PFAS blood tests that can give you some sense of what the level of PFAS is in your body now. And we have a tip card for the PFAS exchange where we have some information about accessing that kind of blood testing. I'm happy to talk to anyone about that if that's of concern.
Sure. My question is about why your bill did not get passed in Massachusetts.
No, and I didn't hear
why the bill didn't pass.
Why the bill didn't get passed?
Oh, I can get into the details. I think what happened, I think there are two things. One is I think industry was pushing back. The second is really just as the bill. So industry has strong influence. They donate a lot of money, and they donated a lot to the leadership, particularly the House leadership, because that's just in our state, the House is a little bit more conservative than Senate, and a lot of the power is held in leadership. So industry donates a lot of money to them. But I think that there was actually, so what ended up happening is something did pass. We passed a ban on PFAS in firefighter personal protective gear, which was very important. We're only the second state to do it. We didn't pass the bigger bill. I think in part what happened is, the bill gets introduced, and then the Public Health Committee sort of worked on rewriting the language. The language that came out of the Public Health Committee actually had some errors in it. And so literally some things where there was circular reasoning, some typos, and we pointed out to the sponsors that didn't work. And they said, okay, well, we'll get it fixed when it goes to House Ways and Means, which is sort of the end of the process. But it didn't get to House Ways and Means until the very last month of the session. So basically, they didn't have time to fix the language, and so they basically ran out of time. So it's a combination of industry pushing. Industry pushing was part of why the language changed. Then we pushed and said this language doesn't make sense. And so part of it, I think, was a little bit of a failure of some of our supporters to maybe dot their I's and check their T's. So we're going to really push to make sure that things come out in a strong way of the committee this session. But I think it's well positioned to pass this session. I think, though, what the fight will be is that industry will try to weaken it. They'll try to redefine PFAS to exclude a lot of the PFAS that are currently used. They'll try to exclude a lot of the products that PFAS are in. Say, well, yeah, sure, you can get it out of these things, but don't get it out of all of these other things. So don't get it out of climate-related products. Don't get it out of food packaging. And I think those are some of the fights we've seen in other states, basically attempts to weaken it so that it covers the fewest products. But I think it was, some, industry, which, is, they're, advocating for their viewpoint. They want to keep selling what they sell. But I do think that there was just some internal goofs that I'm hoping don't happen this time.
And I'll just mention on that, since we've done some state legislative advocacy, 7,000 bills are introduced on the odd number year every year, and then only a small percentage of them actually make it all the way through. What Laura said earlier, it's really important. Get those co-sponsors now, early in the session. Call again when it's coming out of committees and get them out. So, doing those calls, I think, also helps move things along. So that's something, Clean Water Action does, something we do. So it lets you know when to make those calls.
And just to say one other thing, if you feel comfortable with it, and you may not, telling your stories is very impactful because people sometimes will say, oh, well, where are the victims? And we know that people are affected by PFAS. I know, just personally, I also lost my sister very, very young to cancer, and I began talking about it, in a political setting after a while. And the first time I did it, I felt uncomfortable, like, was I using my family's tragedy in a way that didn't feel comfortable? And over time, I began to feel a little bit more comfortable with it. It's very personal with how and when you want to talk about these things. But I think legislators, like everybody, they respond to stories more even than to, the facts that are on a PowerPoint or the list of illnesses that can be caused. And particularly, you're their constituent, so they are supposed to care about you. So if you feel comfortable letting your legislator know that how you're affected, it is very influential. And obviously, if you're not ready for that, that also is fine.
So I'm just thinking maybe we could take 2 more questions, or how do you feel? So a couple. So I see several. I know you've.
Oh, yeah, we got to get you. Yeah, you've been waiting. Yeah, here.
Thank you.
Yep.
I had the one I had written, but I'd like that one. But I also wanted to touch on his when he asked about the testing of your wells and water. It's like not suggested, but sometimes like when you test well water, they always want you to get the first catch in the morning, and sometimes other tests say let it run. So what is your recommendation for testing for PFAS in a private well? And then I have the other question that's actually.
Yeah, great question. So the testing approach depends on what you're trying to test for. so you have poles in the way too. So often we do the first, like that first morning water for lead, because the lead comes out of the pipes, and so when the water sits overnight, then there's opportunity for the lead to leach out of the pipe and end up in the water. And so you want to kind of get that worst case scenario, like what's in the water first thing in the morning. For PFAS, because the PFAS is coming from, you want to know if it's coming from the groundwater. So when we've done home testing in people's homes, we actually let the water run for like 10 minutes so that we're actually, getting water that's sort of coming out of the ground. And so it shouldn't be as affected by if it's first thing, when in the day it is. We actually flush it so that we're pulling that water up. But it's different, again, if you're looking for lead or thinking about other contaminants that come from the plumbing.
Because a lot of people might waste money on tests, not getting the right answer. But I have the other question.
Okay. And so other than PFAS, how are forever chemicals such as phthalates being tested? So phthalates are chemicals that are also of huge concern. They're in food, they're in a lot of consumer products. They're not, I guess I wouldn't call them forever chemicals because their chemical structures are not so persistent. So I think one of the things that's challenging about PFAS is they're in products, they're in water, they're in food, they're in the environment. Like we get them from everywhere. Like mercury is a forever chemical in some ways. It's in fish. We don't really worry about it in water. Same for PCBs. Phthalates don't tend to be an issue so much in water. I haven't seen a lot of testing for it, but they're not chemically as persistent. But we worry about them in products. They don't tend to accumulate in our bodies for as long, but we're exposed all the time, and so we have that kind of constant exposure. And so there are a lot of epidemiological studies, so looking at people who are exposed, and that's everyone because we're all exposed, and trying to get a sense of whether people that have higher levels of phthalates, I think for phthalates it's more looking at in urine rather than in blood. There's different ways to kind of measure exposure, whether people have higher levels of exposure have certain health outcomes, and trying to understand where those exposures are coming from.
So I lied. I'm going to take two. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
If you're concerned about phthalates, there is one other bill that we are working on, Toxic Free Kids Bill, which is a bill to bans PFAS in children's products, but so does this other bill. But the Toxic Free Kids Bill is really focused on getting PFAS and a range of other toxic chemicals out of children's products for children 12 and under, with a particular focus on very young children for the reason that Dr. Shader mentioned, that early life exposures are of particular concern. And that bill would go after phthalates. Some phthalates are already banned in toys, but they're still allowed in personal care products and other products that a child might be exposed to. And if that is a particular concern, I can send a link to, we have another fact sheet on that so that you could weigh in on that one with your legislators.
So yes, you have the mechanism.
This should be quick.
I'll take you because I know you've had your hand up for a while too. And then I think we'll end it there, so thanks. Make sure it's green. Yeah.
Should we be concerned about our consumption of fish, and how would we know the guidelines, or?
Well, do you want to answer that one? Yeah, 'cause I can do that.
We'll both take a stab at that. So fish is a tricky issue when we talk about drinking water. Like water that's been filtered without the PFAS is just as good for you. It just doesn't have the PFAS. But when you're talking about fish, it's more complicated because you can't get the PFAS out of the fish. And fish have health benefits. And so trying to balance the benefits of fish and what we know about the harmful health effects is not an easy balance. And there's also benefits of fishing as an activity. We work with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe in the Cape, and so there's cultural benefits as well. And so there are fish consumption advisories in Massachusetts and some freshwater bodies where there's fish consumption advisories based, I think, on PFOS, so one of the specific PFAS chemicals. So if you're eating local fish, you can check and see if there's any local water bodies that are affected. I don't know if you know which ones. It's a hard comparison too when we're talking about local fish. There's testing and you sort of know where it's coming from if you happen to be catching from a certain water body. But if you go to the grocery store and you eat fish, that also likely has some PFAS, and we know a lot less about it. I would say what we do know is in the general population, again from that big study that CDC does, scientists have analyzed the data, including us, and seen that people who eat more fish on average do have higher levels of PFAS in their blood. But there are also health benefits, and there's also a question of if you eat less fish, what would you eat? Would you eat hamburgers? Like, that's harmful in other ways. So I think that's a kind of hard question to answer, and it's a little less straightforward. Like with mercury, like pregnant moms are advised not to eat tuna because they're at the top of the food chain and they have highest levels of mercury. And there's definitely a trend that way. You go up the food chain, the PFAS increases, but not always. There can be some surprises where fish lower on the food chain also can have high PFAS. So it's complicated. I'd say the first step is to look for local fish consumption advisories. But I find it a challenging question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that, yeah.
Can I add to that? So just some local knowledge. So I just Googled that. I was curious myself. And so if you're aware of the Assawamsett Pond complex, there's Assawamsett, it's the big one. I don't know them all. It's like Quiticus, something, and Long Pond that touches Lakeville and I believe parts of Plymouth. And there is actually a fish advisory for PFAS reasons in Long Pond. And so it's pretty close to home already. And so I called the... I'm not going to remember the name of the department that I called at the state. It was like epidemiology and toxicology studies in the environment or something like that. And they called me back, which was awesome. And they said that basically they have a form that you fill out. And if you have reason to be concerned about the fish, then you should fill in that form and they will follow up the next year, I think it is, to test that. So it's not exactly like a quick thing, but it is something that's out there. And if you Google fish advisories, Massachusetts, there's a really nice website that shows them all, just dots on the map, and you can just click and see. So, yeah.
Would saltwater fish be a little less than freshwater fish, or do we know that?
My guess is on average they would be because saltwater fish, like ocean water, I would think would be lower in PFAS than freshwater in terms of the contamination because the water, any PFAS would be diluted. Short answer.
So one last question.
Okay. My question is about the water we have right now as a town. I'm puzzled by the letter that was on the town's website about how it can be used. You can't ingest it. You can bathe with it. You can even brush your teeth with it. But you should not be ingesting it. But I wonder how innocuous is it if you can't ingest it, but you can still wash your food with it, you can still wash your dishes with it. Don't heat it up because that's going to concentrate the PFAS. But if you have dishwashers that heat up your dishes as they dry, what is the danger? I know that we're at the lower end of the spectrum for what the allowable rating is, but I'm confused by what is actually safe and what is not. I mean, I went straight to bottled water as soon as I learned about this. But I still feel like every day using the water the way I do, just washing my dishes, I'm like, I have no idea how safe this even is.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in terms of why they would say, like, water that they don't recommend drinking is still okay for those other uses has to do with how much water gets into your body through those different pathways. And so often drinking water standards are based on an assumption of something like 2 liters of water that you're taking into your body every day. And if you're talking about washing dishes or bathing, you're not ingesting nearly that volume of water. I think an open question is how much might get absorbed through your skin. But I would say a small amount would probably get through your skin. And in general, it's thought that drinking is the most important way that PFAS can get into your body. In terms of like breathing in, the potential to breathe in PFAS, I guess, there are some things like disinfection byproducts. Some of those are volatile, and so that can be a concern, for instance, from hot showers. I don't know if there are other PFAS in the water that might be volatile for which that might be a concern. But that's sort of the reasoning for, I'm guessing, why they would say, like, at levels over the standard where they're recommending not to drink, that those other uses would still not likely put you over a level of concern of exposure. But I understand, like, it feeling concerning, but in terms of why they are recommending that.
Thank you. Okay.
Do they test the Poland Springs and the bottled water? The bottled water we buy, they do test that?
Yes. Water, In order to, this isn't true in every state, but in Massachusetts, you cannot sell bottled water unless it's been tested for PFAS. And there are quarterly reports that all bottled water wholesalers have to give to the Department of Environmental Protection, and you can actually see the testing results on their website, but it has to be below the state standards.
Definitely Google it though. Google whatever water it is that you're talking about, because it's not all clear, I don't think.
And bottled water has other concerns in terms of the environmental impact and the plastics and all that. So like bottled water is sort of a short-term measure if your water is high and you're not quite sure what to do with it, or you're looking into filters. But in terms, like, I never point people to bottled water because of those concerns. It's great to know. I'm learning things from Laura tonight. So I didn't know about the quarterly testing. Before, what I'd seen was just some voluntary results, which, but it's good to know about that. But I know, like New Hampshire, there was a community where they were going to offer bottled water. And so they're like, well, we better test this before we offer it. And they did some testing and actually found a bottling plant in Haverhill that had high PFAS, and they had never had to test for it before. It was before the Massachusetts state standard. So it can pop up in places that you don't expect.
And they closed down, I believe.
Yeah.
That was a big news story in the Globe. It was maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
So we are going to end this, but Sandy Smiley, who's on our Sustainable Middleborough team, has one quick comment, she says. So I want to let her have it.
Actually, it's a request. So many people, one of the things we said that the town is doing is giving these wonderful notices. If you're really interested about this, please let the water department or the town manager know that it's a great idea, but it would be wonderful to get it the day before instead of after they've already done the thing at 8 o'clock in the morning. I appreciate it, but the people that are really worried need to know in advance to drink the bottled water the next day. So thank you. If you get a chance to talk to anybody important in that issue, let them know. Just do it earlier.
Good news, I believe I heard just as of the last couple days, I think they've got that figured out. And so I think
This week, the notice came out the day before.
okay, so yep, loud and clear.
So thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming. This is a great turnout, and we appreciate it very much. And thank you to our 2 experts so much for coming to Middleborough. And before you leave, please come by, pick up any literature you want, sign up for the action alerts on the mailing list. We'd appreciate it.
And please go to healthymiddleborough.org and sign up for our emails. Thank you.